Welcome to the presentation in how to learn Gemara. This is overwhelming. This presentation is really meant for parents, mothers included, and Mechanchim, Rebbeim, in order to, number one, sensitize ourselves to the overwhelming obstacles that a child faces when they are first introduced to Gemara, number one. Number two, how can we make learning Gemara without it being an artificial way of learning, but real learning in a way that the child actually says, oh my gosh, this makes sense. I'm learning how to learn by myself. And that really is the ultimate goal. What is the goal of learning? Well, the goal of learning is not to teach. The goal of learning is for the child to learn how to learn on their own. The goal of learning any area, whether it's Chumash, they got no shorashim, prefix, suffixes. There are mechanics that without which you cannot succeed in learning Chumash. Child doesn't know shorashim, prefixes, suffixes, and basic dikduk, then we're asking to tax the mind of the child to memorize lots and lots of words without understanding how they really correctly construct and translate. Beni, my son. Banim, children. Banai, my children. Levanecha, to your children. Lebenai, to his child. Lebincha, to your child. Ulevanecha, and to your children. There's so many permutations. There are mechanics. That means there are nuts and bolts without which this item that you're trying to construct will fall apart. So without the nuts and bolts of Chumash, it's going to be artificial learning. We can talk about Mishnah another time. Right now we're jumping to Gemara. There are nuts and bolts of Gemara learning, and we're going to try and identify what are those nuts and bolts so that when we look at, number one, the overwhelming obstacles that children face in learning Gemara, then we can understand how to make those obstacles either move out the way or easy to overcome. So I hope you follow the logic so far. We are going to simply look at, and this is, I'm going to use the expression, deceptively simple way of teaching Gemara. It's a way in which you get the children to be in the driver's seat of the Gemara immediately. And you're going to see how. So number one, the most obvious obstacle is Gemara is in our spoken tongue, or it's in another language, which we don't even speak at home or on the street or anywhere. And the obvious answer is, yeah, Aramaic is a unspoken language today for the most part. So then the question begs, so why was the Gemara written in Aramaic? And the answer is, that was the vernacular. That was the spoken language in Iraq, in Bavel at that time. Oh, okay. So now we have a language barrier where it's not only a spoken language today, but it's an ancient language. Okay, what else is an obstacle? An obvious obstacle is the logic of the Gemara is not typical to Chumash or Mishnayos. Chumash and Mishnayos stand on their own and are not enough information for you to be able to make sense out of the Chumash, not enough information in the Mishnah to make sense out of the Mishnah. You're completely dependent on the Torah Sheba'al Peh to fill in the missing gaps, both for Chumash, Nach, and Mishnah. Mishnah is written very cryptic, very concise, very abridged, Kitzur Lashon. When it comes to Gemara, Gemara is a perush to the Mishnah. It's written in Aramaic. So now let's understand this in a very logical way. The Chumash has two components to it. There's a storyline and there's Tariq mitzvahs. Those are the two components in the most skeletal definition of what the Oraisa, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah really are. You've got the storyline, Brias Ha'olam, till the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, and now Yeshua enters Eretz Yisrael. That's already Sefer Yeshua. So from Brias Ha'olam till the end of 40 years in the Midbar, that's the entire Chumash. Brias Ha'olam, creation of the world, 10 generations from Adam till Noach, the Mabul, 10 generations from Noach till Avram. Then you have the life of Avram, Yitzhak and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel and Leah, Shiftei Kah. Yosef is sold into slavery. Brothers go down to get grain, really looking for their brother, reunite. Then starts Shibud Mitzrayim, we're already now in Shmois, and begins the Makos, and then Yetziat Mitzrayim, then Matan Torah, we're in Parshas Yisrael, and now you've got 40 years in the Midbar, that takes you through to the end of Devarim, and that's the entire Chumash. That's the storyline, obviously in skeletal form. Plotted throughout the storyline are Tariag Mitzvahs. Neither the storyline nor the Tariag Mitzvahs in the Torah are self-explanatory. There's nothing there that you can understand. Not a single mitzvah, not even a single pasuk. Every pasuk screams out darsheni, extrapolate, open me up and see that I've got missing information, and you will find that missing information in the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh means you are talui, you're completely dependent on a Rebbe, a living Talmid Hacham, a student of a Hacham who has his information from a Hacham who himself was Mishamish, another Hacham, and that's what a Talmid Hacham is. You're a student of a Hacham who has the Masorah, who lives the Masorah, who breathes the Masorah. But the goal of having the Talmid is to Vehemidu Talmidim Harbe. That's the first Mishnah in Perkei Avos, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. The Masorah depends on the Rebbe standing up, that's the real Lashon, standing up students many times. Literally, not how many students, but how many times you stand up. That's each individual student. It's about supporting the children till they can stand up on their own 2 feet, which is an expression Chazal give us for independence. So the goal of learning is to become independent. You can't do that with Chumash without a Rebbe who's part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now you've got all the Perushim and everything's written down. But the original intent was to force you to be part of people who live this Torah. And that was really always l'chatchila. When they wrote down the Mishnah, it was written so you couldn't understand it. You're forced to go to a Rebbe to be part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So they preserved this constant immediacy and intimacy with real Talmidei Hachamim, with real Hachamim, real Tzaddikim. When the Gemara had to be written within 300 years of the closing of the Mishnah, the interesting thing about the Gemara is that it preserved the same format of forcing your mind to think, because it was written in question-answer format, problem-solution. So now that you understand that this is basically the, so to speak, structure of Chumash, Mishnah, Gemara. Chumash was written so you can't understand it, you're forced to think. Mishnah was written so you're forced to think, ask questions. The Gemara is that format of question-answer, question-answer. So that's always been the Milchamta Shel Torah, the meeting of minds. Now let's understand when we put this under the microscope and make the picture bigger and see what is revealed. You've got the Chumash with a storyline and Tariag Mitzvahs. The Mishnah is a perush to Tariag Mitzvahs. This is not Jonathan Mieti speaking, well, it's me speaking, but the Rav Bartanura, first Rav on Pirkei Avos, identifies that the reason why Pirkei Avos is a Masechta of Mishnayos that is unique to all the rest of the other 62 Masechtas of Mishnayos is because it's the only one that is not meyuchad, not exclusively a perush to any of the Tariag Mitzvahs. So it comes out that every single one of the Mishnayos is really the first time that they're now taking Tariag Mitzvahs in the Torah and giving you some details. Actually, much later on, the Rambam, he bases his entire Mishnah Torah on the structure of Tariag Mitzvahs. He gives you that as a table of contents, and now he gives you the details of Tariag Mitzvahs. And the Mishnah Torah is the linchpin, so to speak, between final halacha, the final legal decisions, and the Chumash. In between, you've got Mishnah and Gemara. The Mishnah and the Gemara is the first time that they're now explaining Tariag Mitzvahs in the form of the Mishnah, and then the Gemara is now unloading the information so you can understand the reasoning behind the machlekes in the Mishnah. So now, why am I giving you this as a Hagdama? It's very, very important. Because once you know that Gemara is a discussion, a perush to the Mishnah, which itself is a perush to Tariag Mitzvahs, you will appreciate that if our children are learning Gemara without knowing Tariag Mitzvahs and Mishnayos, they're learning a commentary to something they're not familiar with, to the Mishnah, and they're learning the Mishnah, which is a commentary to something else they're not familiar with. So you've got, I'm trying to bring out what are the obstacles. There's Chesaron Yediyah. The Gemara, as you know, any daf of Gemara you're going to go through, there's constant quotes from a Mishnah, from a Brisa, from a Pasuk, and that's working on the assumption that the person who's dialoguing with the Gemara, the person who's learning the Gemara, the person who's part of this discussion, knows that that information that's missing and that's been quoted. So the Gemara is clearly assuming that you have a decent familiarity with Tariq mitzvahs of the Chumash and the Mishnah, which is the first attempt to start detailing those Tariq mitzvahs. So that's a very big obstacle, number one. Number two, obviously the language. Number three, the logic of the Gemara is unusual. It's different. Number four, no punctuation throughout the text. Number five, there are no vowels. There's no nukudais. Number seven, if you want, is everything's put into columns. So there's no breaks of paragraphs, sentences. There are no visible breaks in the punctuation because there is no punctuation. So what ends up happening is you're throwing the child into, and this Chas v'Shalom is not a put down on the system. I'm sharing, first of all, this is the most important, like diagnosis. Where if there is a problem, the first thing we need to do before we try and implement a solution is identify what are the parts of the problem. If there's more than one part, what is it? Because if I try to fix one part of a problem, but it's related to other parts, I may do more damage or fix one thing, but really it's only artificial because there's much more items that in the bigger picture need to be addressed. So what we're doing here is not Chas v'Shalom a knocking of the system, Chas v'Shalom, no benefit to that. We're trying to diagnose what are the obstacles children encounter in learning Gemara, and once we have diagnosed all the major factors that contribute to the difficulty in mastering Gemara, now we can switch to the solution which will encompass and address all the difficulties that we're noticing. So the child has difficulty with Aramaic, it's not their language. There's no punctuation, there's no voweling, there's no splits or breaks in the sentences or paragraphs, so there's no order in the page surah, in the shape of the page, to understand here's a major point, here's a minor point that belongs to that major point, and now there's some more breaks, and I understand what everything is part of. I'll give you a simple example. As you know, in the Chumash, it's actually written in a very orderly fashion. The Sefer Torah has been divided into weekly portions, and each weekly portion is broken down into an aliyah, and each aliyah, you'll notice, there's ptuchos and stumos throughout the Sefer Torah. A ptucha means that the margin at the end of a sentence goes all the way till the end. It's completely empty margin, all the way till the end of the margin. And sutumais is referring to where you've got text, blank, and then text in that same column. So the ptuchos and the stumos, it's the first Rashi in Vayikra, mentions there twice. The purpose of those ptuchos and stumos was for Moshe Rabbeinu to be mispoinen on the tersh bal peh contained in each paragraph. So the concept, though, is really the following. A ptucha, which is the end of a sentence, and now the margin goes all the way to the end of the margin of the Sefer Torah, that is to tell you that the next paragraph is we're opening a new subject. Satumais means to say that this is a subcategory of the previous subject. So there is actually an order inside the Chumash. Masha Enkein, the Gemara, interestingly, between one Mishnah and the next Mishnah, you can have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or more dapim, more pages, and they're known as amudim because they are columns of information, no breaks, no punctuation. It's a language the child doesn't understand. The logic is new to the child. So these are all pieces stacked against him before we even realize that the Gemara is assuming that when it borrows a brisa from a Tosefta, a brisa from Sifra, Sifri, Mechilta, is borrowing a pasuk somewhere in Tanakh. It's telling you a Mishnah that seems to contradict the Mishnah in this particular case. The Gemara is clearly assuming that you are familiar with that reference and that enormous Yama Talmud, enormous amount of information that is being borrowed from and referenced to the point that they're making in this part of the Gemara. So when you put all these pieces together, we realize, of course, it's going to be very difficult for a child to swim in the Yama Talmud without drowning, Chas v'Shalom. Forgive me for using that analogy. But we have a serious magefa, we have a serious problem where an enormous proportion of children, they're dying to learn, they really want to, but are having a tremendous difficulty. And so what we're trying to do in this very simple presentation, you'll see it's less than an hour, is first identify what are those obstacles, and now how do you rectify those obstacles. This presentation is almost completely based on the Stipler of blessed memory. Yaakov Yisrael Kanievsky, Reb Chaim's Shlita's father, Gadol Hador, and the Steipler Tzal, in his famous sefer, Kriyana D'igrasa, he has there in Igeres Yud, and you'll find it in Ois Tes, Yud and Yud Aleph. That's basically what I'm going to be sharing with you. He offers in his very simple letter to a bacher who's struggling and learning what you need to do to overcome those obstacles. So, now that we've understood what some of those obstacles are, let us understand that if we don't address a child's non-familiarity with the information, we don't address the fact that they may not be able to read the words because this is a language unfamiliar to the child. And there are no nakudas in a regular Gemara. There's no punctuation in a regular Gemara. With all these stacked against him, the chances of him being successful are weakened and lessened. And we don't want to make it harder. We want to make it not just easy, we want to make it navigatable. We want to give the child the right tools that you can't just plonk them in a car and say go. And his question is, where? And if I don't give him a map and I don't show him these pedals, this is the gas or accelerator, this is the brake. If you're using a stick for shift, this is the clutch. If I'm not going to show the child the steering wheel and the various functions of the different parts, the indicator, the lights, then the chances of the child getting to where he has to get to are diminished, and the chances of him not driving safely are also increased, and the chances of him having a satisfying experience are also decreased. So obviously, if I'm going to put him in the driver's seat, he has to have some familiarity and shibush, some familiarity and experience in understanding the different components. There's a road, there's a map, this is how to read the map, this is how to read the stop sign, green sign, this is how to know, without the GPS. GPS is a great technology, but it also is a substitute for my mind, thinking about where I'm going. The Gemara doesn't work that way, and any substitute for that is going to be artificial because we want the child to be independent. Independent means he's not dependent on other crutches to be able to learn. He can learn by himself. He can figure it out on his own. And you're going to see in less than about half an hour, we're going to actually cover those points in a way that is, I would call, deceptively simple, because Gemara cannot possibly be so difficult that a doctor gets a medical degree after 5, 6, 7 years medical school. An attorney gets a law degree after 4, 5, 6 years in law school. An engineer 4, 5 years in engineering school. It doesn't make sense that a child who's in yeshiva learning for a decade or two cannot navigate almost any Gemara and have a retention, a kinyan, owns and remembers what he's learned. But if we don't have a system to enable a child, because we're not giving them the tools to navigate the Yama Talmud, then it makes total sense that a lot of children after high school or beyond will give up Has v'Shalom and never want to open up a Gemara ever again. So let's identify some of the ways we can overcome these obstacles. So I'm going to share with you now 4 steps, which the Gemara is assuming you have covered before the Gemara begins. So there are pre-steps. These are 4 pre-steps that the Gemara is assuming you already have a mastery of before the Gemara starts its dialogue, before the Gemara starts its discussion. And once you understand these steps, it's going to become very obvious that if I don't deliver to the children a way to master each one of these 4 and 4 combined, I am setting them up for a level of failure. The Mitsuyanim may be able to get it, and there'll be some B students who will rely on memorization, but there's still going to be a very serious dropout level of the C students, the B students, and later on the A students, if we don't enable them to have not just the tools, but also sipuk hanefesh, a love and enjoyment of the learning, which only really comes because they figured it out themselves. They feel themselves becoming independent. And you've got to help them to see that. And I'm going to share with you a deceptively simple way to do that in not hours, weeks and months and years, but in minutes. the mind will already be saying, oh my gosh, if I learn like this, oh, I get it. You, Rebbe, are giving me the tools to be able to navigate this myself. You're showing me where's the clutch, where's the gears, where's the steering wheel, which is the brake, which is the accelerator, the gas, and you're showing me a map, you're showing me the keys on the map of how to identify where I am, how to reroute myself if I make a mistake, because I went down dual carriageway, which is going in the wrong direction. So how do I make I can't make a U-turn there, so I've got to make a jug handle turn around. So give the children the ability to read the map so they can see wherever they are on the map, this is where I am, this is where I want to get to. This is the most direct route, these are other routes. But they can read the map so they can identify, they can figure out on their own. And transpose that idea into learning Gemara, we're going to see how this really works. So, watch this. Step number 1. Can the child read accurately? The words of Aramaic are not easy. They're not familiar. The kid has not seen these words before. A few familiar statements, havamina, the Gemara terminology that we use here and there, la'afuke. We might have heard that, and it's part of our yeshivish culture and conversation, but it's not nearly enough to be able to make sense out of the Gemara. So this is an unknown language. But the first thing we need to do in establishing, the goal is to become an independent learner. Can he read the words accurately? Because if he can't read the words accurately, then even if he understands what he's been taught that these words represent, but he can't read them himself, he won't be able to reconstruct the words on his own. And if he can't reconstruct the words on his own, it's going to sabotage his independence. Independence, remember, is the goal. Independently be able to learn Gemara. So number 1, can he read accurately? Number 2, can he translate each word? If he can't translate each word, he's not going to be able to put this together and create a sentence. So we've got to help him to be able to translate each individual word. Number 3, can he punctuate the text? Punctuate the text means, does he know where a comma would go, a period or full stop if you're from Britain, an exclamation mark, where would a question mark go, where would a quotation mark go? And number 4, put these 3 clues together, can you come up with a simple meaning? Now watch this. We're going to do this very simply. Number 1, can the child read accurately? So I'm going to share with you, as you know, Tuvia Shas in Monsey has popularized the Gemara to become menukad. Now, some people have a problem with that, thinking, well, that's a real crutch. He has the Gemara Nikud and Rashi and Tosfos, and down the side of every single Gemara, he also has a list of Rashi Tevis, so that the Rashi Tevis, the abbreviated words inside the Gemara, have been fully written out in alphabetical order along the margin of every single page. He's maintained the Tzura Sadaf. Now, why am I sharing this with you? I don't get a commission on Tuvia Shas, but watch this. What's the makar for putting this in Nikud? So, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just for your information, it's very, very valuable to know. The church owned all the printing presses for the simple reason this way they could control the information that was being distributed through this new technology known as printing. However, the Gedolim who put the first contract together for Shas Bavli to be printed required of the typesetters that they put in the punctuation. And the Nikud. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. Actually, they did start putting in the punctuation. But they found that after the first Mishnah in Brachas, they realized it's so tedious, so laborious, it will be an impossible task, it'll take forever, and Shas Bavli will never get done. So they scratched that part of the contract. Don't believe me? You can look at the template of any Gemara Brachas. Any Gemara Brachas. I just pulled out this one from Moznaim Press, and just look carefully. And you will see the original Nikud of, in this case, the punctuation is still there. Me'ei masai koirenet shema be'arvin. Period. What's that period doing there? Misha sha'kohanim nichnasim le'echol b'trumasan at soif hashmua rishona divrei Rebbe Eliezer. Period. Where did that come from? V'hachamim oimrim ad chatzos. Period. Really? Rav Gamliel oimer ad shel amud hashacha. Period. Then continues the Mishnah Maisa, and you'll see at each point where it's an end of a major point of sentence, there's a period there. Where does that come from? And you'll only find it in the first Mishnah. Because the template of the original Shas Bavli is the same one that we've been using for the last few hundred years, and it's on every single Gemara. Every single first Mishnah on any Gemara Brachas, you'll see the same thing there. So actually, the original contract required of them punctuation and nikud. They dropped it for practical reasons. It was just too much typesetting. I don't know if some of you will remember the old days of printing before the advent of the computer and the PC. A typesetter was called a typesetter because he had to set every single letter on top of a bar, a little ledge, and then the next letter, and the next letter, and then another one for a comma, another one. And this was extreme. Every single letter was placed by hand. That's called typesetting. That's the original term. So to put in nikud and the punctuation, that's 3 times the work. Oh, so that was dropped completely. If you're still not convinced, let me share with you. Reb Chaim Oizer Grudzinski, of blessed memory, in 1906, yes, you heard me right, was fundraising to put the nikud in the entire Shas. He succeeded in bringing out the first Masechta. It was actually Masechtas Gittin. You'll look closely and you'll see the nikud is actually in the text. Why? Reb Chaim Oizer Grudzinski, Gadol Hadar tells us the reason why is Hatfasnu et ha'apanim kulai menukad. We have printed out the entire face of the Gemara menukad. Same source of daf, but it's completely menukad with all the voweling. L'toeles hatalmidim shelo yikashlu bilshonam. For the purpose of benefiting the students, they shouldn't make mistakes in their pronunciation. Ubishinunam, and in their review. You see, if you make a mistake the first time and then you review the mistake and review the mistake, not reading accurately will equal not being able to reconstruct the text because I don't know what I'm saying. So number one, can the child read accurately? That can be easily solved by using a Gemara nikud. And now more and more editions of the Gemara are coming out, menukud. But I would recommend use the Tuvia Shas. He has, I think, about half of Shas already completed. All of Kedushin, Bava Metzia, Bava Kama. I think all of Moed has been completed as well. Nazir, Soita. There's most of the Masechtas of Nashim and Nezikim. And as we're going through this cycle of Daf Yomi, he's following the cycle to finish up the Masechtas as they are completed. So I would highly recommend that if you're choosing a Masechta of what to learn for your Talmidim, choose one that has a Gemara Nikud, Menukud, and don't worry about Masorah or not Masorah about Nikud, because the reason why we don't have Nikud in most of the editions of Shas was not because it's a Masorah not to, it was actually Ferket, it was the contrary. Originally it was supposed to be there. Reb Chaim Oizer Grudzinski actually reinstalled it. However, as you know, 1906 was just before the First World War, which decimated the Klal Yisrael, and we don't talk about it that much because the Second World War in magnitude was so horrific that we've completely lost focus of how damaging the First World War was to the Torah world. So the entire project was completely dropped, being that starvation and survival was the only real agenda, and not paying for Shas Menukud. But that was the intent, to be able to establish that children will be able to read accurately, so that not only will they not make mistakes in their first reading, but in their shinun, in their repetition and sharpening of their minds, they'll be pronouncing the words correctly so they can know what they're reading. So that's number one. Number two, translate each individual word. Now here I'm basing this on the Stipler. The Stipler says in the Sefer I quoted earlier, Kriyana Digrasa, in Igeres Yud. He says in Eis Yud Aleph that you should break the Gemara down into piskei. He suggests 10 or more sections. I call piskei, I call it bites of information. Now I'm going to help you identify what's called a bite of information. A kasha, a question the Gemara brings up, is one byte of information. The teretz, its answer, is a byte of information. A quote from a brisa, that's a byte of information. A quote from a pasuk, that's a byte of information. Take one byte of information at a time, and now we're going to go through these 4 levels. Read accurately that one byte of information. Number 2, can you translate each individual word? You're just dealing with one byte of information. It's just a question right now that the Gemara is asking, and just translate each individual word. If you don't know how to translate each individual word, then help the students. I'm not a big lover of word sheets. Put that aside for now, because anything that becomes a substitute for learning inside has the danger that unless it really is directly helping the children make sense out of the text, you want the kids not sitting in the passenger seat. You want them sitting in the driver's seat, getting the real experience of driving themselves, that they're the ones who's doing the actual work. You want them doing all the work. And what I'm sharing with you is not going to get you off the hook from preparing the shir. On the contrary, you'll see you're going to have to be sharper. But it is going to mean that you're giving the children real tools for becoming independent learners. And you'll see how fast this really works. So number 2, how do I help my kids to translate each individual word? So if a kid doesn't know the word, ask the rest of the class. Does anyone know what this word means? Where can we find the answer? So let them open up a Masifta Gemara. Let them open up Hebrew art scroll. Let them open up a dictionary. And if they have to, let them open up an English art scroll. The point here is not to use a translation as a crutch, has v'shalom, because then that becomes dependent learning. And I never really become independent. I can use it as a reference, and that's really what it's intended for. So use any translation you want or a dictionary and get them doing all the work. And any word they're not sure of, let them write it on top of that word in the Gemara. Let them write it in pencil on top of that word of the Gemara. So number 1, can you read accurately? Solve that by using a Gemara menukad. That's assuming they can actually read. Number 2, translate each individual word of that byte of information. Number 3, what's the punctuation here? Where does a comma belong? Where does a period, a full stop? Where is there an exclamation mark or a question mark or a quotation mark? And put that in. Have the kids do this either collectively in the classroom or split them up into groups of 2 or even 3 and have them work this out, these three steps so far. Now comes step number 4, and it's going to get really exciting. That's my personal opinion. See for yourself. Number 4, put on your Sherlock Holmes cap, put on your detective cap, and now figure like this. You've got 3 clues to come up with Poshup Shut, simple meaning. Clue number 1, you can read the words. 2, you can translate the individual words. 3, you know how to punctuate the text. And number 4, okay, put these 3 together and now come up with a Poshup Shut, a simple meaning that strings this together. These 4 steps is what the Gemara assumes you already can do. Before the Gemara starts its dialogue. Gemara is dialogue. Gemara is question, answer, problem, solution format. And it will go sequentially through the Mishnah. Every Gemara does this. We'll go sequentially through the Mishnah, finding problems in the way the Mishnah was deliberately written, and pounce on those problems. Bring out a question that's there. Why aren't you using this pasuk? Why are you using this pasuk? Oh, but we've got a brisa that seems to have the same mechanics as this Mishnah, but gives a different psak, a different legal conclusion. So what's the nafkamina between the two? The Gemara will find a problem, if there is one there, and it will pronounce that problem. So before the Gemara starts doing that, the Gemara assumes you can do this. You know Pashup Shat on those 1 or 2 lines, what we call a byte of information. The way the stipler says, break each amud down into at least 10 different points, if necessarily more. He doesn't give an exact number. He says piske, piske. You got a psak means the way you cut off. So there's a clear demarcation line between, oh, here's a quote, beginning quote, end of quote. Oh, here's a question, it starts here, ends here. That's a psak. Close there, stop there. Like sof pasuk, like the end of a verse. Oh, here is a quote from a pasuk. Here's a quote from a brisa. Begins here, ends here. So that's what piske piske means. So now comes along the brisa, the stipler, and offers really the following. Once you got the kids doing the first 4 steps and you're getting them doing it, now you can go to step number 5. And you haven't taught them anything yet. You're just giving them tools to be able to teach themselves. Watch this. Number 5. What questions do you have on Pshat? Ask this to the class. Ask the groups or the chavrusas in the pairs or groups of 3, if you want to make even groups of 4, 3 is good, and have them discuss between themselves, do they have any kashas, any shaylas, any questions that come up on Pashup Pshat? So number 5 is, what are you the students, your questions on Pshat? You might want to say, this is 5a, and 5b would be, what other questions do you have on Pshat? Meaning you want to draw out of the mind of the children, squeeze all their thinking and ability to identify problems in the Mishnah, which the Mishnah has definitely got. There's no Mishnah that is just completely straightforward. Especially the Lamdasha Gemaras are going to nitpick and find problems with the way the Mishnah was deliberately written, because the missing information is the Gemara. So, what questions do you have on Pshat? What other questions do you have on Pshat? That's number 5. Now, number 6 is, don't deliver the answers yourself. That's the worst thing I can do. The worst thing I can do as a teacher is teach. What do I mean by that? I'm not trying to be revolutionary over here. This is what Chazal say. My mamukim eitze belevish. It's a pasuk in Mishlei Perek Chaf. There are deep waters in the mind of every child, every person. Ve'ishtvuna yedlena. And the person of understanding, yedlena, will draw it out. You see, the purpose of a teacher is to deliver information or to draw it out of the student. If it's to draw it out of the student, what's the din kadim over here? What's the predicate? What's the assumption? The assumption is, you can figure this out yourself. I, as a teacher, have an obligation to direct your mind and facilitate your ability to come to the questions and the answers yourself. So number 6 of this process is, what's your answer? What's the din kadima in that? You can figure out an answer. Now I have the groups working through steps 1, 2, 3, 4. Can each of the 2 boys in every chavrusa, or 3 boys in a group, go through all 4 steps so that each of them know to read accurately that bite of information? And they figured out the punctuation. And now they've figured out the types as well, the types of punctuation, and now they're coming up with Pashup Pshat. They all know collectively in the whole class that your next step is, what questions do you have on Pshat? What other questions do you have on Pshat? And now you turn to them and say, what are your answers? That's this number 6. What are your answers? I'm not interested in mine. I'm interested in your mind being developed over here. So you as a Rebbe, you still have plenty of preparation to do, because what's going to happen next is mind-blowing. The children will come up with kashas that the Gemara itself is going to come up with, or that Rashi is bothered by and will be addressing, and possibly even Tosfos. And when you get the children to figure out the answers themselves, now is where you come into play. That if you have prepared the Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, and with some other Pirushim, Rishonim, and possibly even Achronim, what's going to happen next is mind-boggling. When the child puts his hand up and comes up with a kasha, and you write it down, another kid has another kasha, and between the 3 or 4, 5, 6 groups in the classroom, you come up with 2 or 3 questions. Now when you throw it to them, what's your answer? And you get them thinking, the 2 or 3 answers they'll come up with invariably will be something that Rashi is addressing, or Tosfos, or Rishon. Or the Gemara itself will be coming up with this question in the next few lines, or maybe on the next Amud. So you as the Rebbe who's prepared will actually now be able to do something which is going to blow the kids' minds. Listen carefully. Moshe, wow, that was your kasha? That's amazing, because that's Rashi's problem that he's bothered by. And when we're going to learn it inside, we're going to see Tosfos. Tosfos, in his second explanation of Rashi, has your answer. How does the kid feel? How does the kid feel that he came up with a kasha that bothers Rashi, and that Tosfos brings out, and in his second teretz gives the teretz that Moshe came up with? How does Moshe feel? $1 million. He's sitting next to the Rashbam, Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi, the Bali Tosfos, Ramoshe Mekusi. Really? Yes. Now what happens if a kid comes up with a kasha and that's Rabbi Akiva Eiger's kasha? How does a kid feel now when you show, oh my gosh, you came up with Rabbi Akiva Eiger's kasha? How does the kid feel? You're putting the children immediately into the driver's seat, because you're showing them you can think for yourselves. You can figure this out yourselves. The Gemara was not written 1700 years ago, for the Amoraim to have the Masechtas on their shelves and learn it between themselves. This is written l'dairei dairos. And it wasn't written so that only the exclusive elite have access. No, it's written for everyone, all Klal Yisrael. It is true the Rambam saw a tzoirach in the Shah, it was like a Hayrah Shah almost, that he wrote a codified version of all the legal conclusions of the Gemara, incorporating all Mishnayos and Gemara and Tosefta and Sifra and Sifri and all of Tanakh, basically all of Nigla, and that was one of the big tainas against the Rambam at the time, that he took away the process of thinking, of learning Mishnah and Gemara, which is the Shagdavataria, the back and forth, Milchamta Shel Torah, the meeting of minds and fighting it out to understand and get a kinyan, where the kinyan is because you fought for it, earned it, owned it, and now you'll remember it because you worked so hard for it. But these are the first 6 steps. First 1 through 4 is what the Gemara is assuming you already have before the Gemara starts. But this is where the Gemara begins. The Gemara is going to start with a kasha. The Gemara is going to start with a comment or a comparison from another brisa or from a different pasuk. It's going to find something wrong with the way the Mishnah is written. The first Mishnah in Brachas, the first Mishnah in Shas, from when do you read Shema in the evening? What's the obvious kasha? Think about it. And what's the best way to start a class? To start off with a question, Rebbe, why are you asking? Give us some information first. We don't have any. Give us the information, then ask us a kasha. No. It's asking you a kasha. When can you start reading the Shema in the evening? A question contains information. There's 2 pieces of information, at least. 2 pieces of information contained in the question. What's the question? From when can you read Shema in the evening? So what information is contained in that? There's something called Shema, and it's time-bound somewhere in the evening. It has a starting point. Oh. So the Mishnah is assuming you have those 2 pieces of information as a frame of reference. In fact, the first question the Gemara is going to ask on the Mishnah, and remember we said the Gemara will go sequentially in the order through the Mishnah, finding problems with the Mishnah, which are deliberately there. The first question the Gemara is going to ask is, Tana Heichakai, where is the author of the Mishnah, where's his standing point of reference? Diktani, that he goes and learns, Me'emasai. First walk into the shir and say, okay, Kinlach, how many mitzvahs are there in the Torah? 613. Very good. Of the 613, one of them is Kriyat Shema. The recital of these 3 paragraphs. Okay, you want to go with Midiraita, it's the first paragraph. Okay, first pasuk, etc. The Torah tells us, B'shach b'chav kamecha, you should recite this when you lie down and when you rise up. So that means the morning and the evening. Shach b'cha is evening first, lying down, and uvkamecha when you rise up. So there's 2 times to recite the Shema, evening and morning. And our first kasha now is, what's the definition of the beginning of the evening till the end, and the beginning of the morning till the end? And that's what we have to now discuss. That is logical, that's rational. That's not Torah. That's not the way the Torah wants us to learn. Yeah, the Rambam did do that because there was a need. But the original format was, don't give enough information in order to force the mind to think. So the minds are working together, fighting this out, figuring it out. Not enough information in the Mishnah, which is written 1,300 years after the Torah Sheba'al Peh was given. For 1,300 years, we were holding on to the information over here. And when they wrote it down, it was so cryptic, you couldn't understand it without the Gemara, which wasn't written till the next 300 years. Oh, so it's always preserving that your mind has to be engaged with a Rebbe, with a teacher, and you're thinking, you're fighting it through with your chavrusa. So this has always been the format. So comes along, number 6, get the kids to figure it out themselves. You as the Rebbe who's prepared will now be able to tell the children where their answers and the questions are in the text. And when they learn it inside, how will the kid feel? Wow, this is my kasha, the Rashi came. I'm speaking with Rashi, I'm speaking with the Rabbeinu Tam, with Balei Tosfos, I'm in the shir with Rishonim and Achronim. Yes, because you're giving them the real tools. Now, number 7 of this, again, going back to the Stipler, he says, review this 4 times. Review this one bite of information 4 times. Now that you have learnt it inside, you can read the words accurately, you can translate it. You know where it's a question, where it's a comma, where it's a period, full stop, it's a quotation mark. You know how to read it intelligently, okay, and you know what Pashup Pshat is, and you saw a couple of kashas and a teretz. Okay, now do review. How many times? 4 times. Stipler learns it from Gemara in Eruvin Daf Nun Dalet Amud Beis, where it talks about Chazara, a very important Gemara there. It learns about the Seder HaLimud of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, Ketzad Seder HaMishnah, which Rashi explains how was the Torah Sheba'al Peh taught. Moshe Rabbeinu taught it 4 times. So he did Chazara 4 times, and Aaron heard it 4 times, and all the Shvatim and the Bnei Aaron, everyone heard the Torah at least 4 times on every paragraph of the parasha of the Torah. So learn it 4 times, quick review. Now go to the next bite of information. So number 8, go to the next bite of information, the next 1 or 2 lines, the kasha or the teretz or the brisa or the pasuk, and do the same 6 steps. Go through the same 6 steps. Can you read it accurately? Can you punctuate and translate and put it together into a simple Pashup Pshat? And then, what kashas do you have? What answers? And this is called the long but short way. It's going to take longer at the beginning, as the Stipler points out. It takes some time to get into the regilas of it, but it will start getting faster. But here's the most important piece. The children will chap immediately. Every single kid in the classroom will chap immediately. I get it. You, Rebbe, are figuring out how to give me the map and the tools to navigate the map. You're giving me the tools to know how to turn left, turn right, how to go forward, how to stop, how to pause. You're helping me understand what I need to know to make sense out of the Gemara on my own. So you're really empowering the students day one. And even though it's going to go slow at the beginning, you're going to be picking up a lot of pace because you're giving the children the responsibility, key word, the responsibility for becoming independent learners on their own. So go through, next bite of information, number 8, go through the same 6 steps. Once you've threshed this out, do your Chazara 4 times, and now you can go to number 9. Number 9 is review the previous bites of information till now. That means don't go to the next bite of information and go through all 6 steps until you've first done a quick review from the first bite till now. Watch this. And just be honest with me. In the vast majority of cases, and Hashrama, this is not a put down, I'm sharing this as an observation. In the vast majority of cases, how long does it take to, let's say, learn an Amud of Gemara? A week and a half, whatever it is. Let's say 5 weeks into the Zman, and the kids have covered, let's say, 3 blood. Okay? Now, I'm just asking an honest question. It's not Has v'Shalom as a kitruk Has v'Shalom. Ask the children in the classroom, the students, almost high school, almost doesn't matter which age. You've spent 5 weeks on 3 or 4 blood, and each week you're putting in several hours a day, maybe even more, 5, sometimes 6 days a week. So you're coming out with maybe 20 hours a week times 5, so it's about 100 hours. Now, ask the children to please put a show of hands. How many of you are willing to say, not Baal Peh, but just tell me the structure of question-answer, problem-solution format, starting from the Mishnah to where you're up to in the Gemara? How many hands will go up to say, I can do the last 3 blot from beginning to where we're up to and explain it? And very sadly, I'm just asking you to be honest with ourselves. Very sadly, I think very few hands will go up. How can that be? 100 hours? Why is that? Well, very simple. My focus is only where I am right now on this Amud. But if I don't do Chazara from the beginning of the Gemara to where we're up to, and I don't review the previous bites of information to where I'm up to, I will lose the flow. And I'll forget what I'm even connected to in the first place. So the key here in number 9 is don't go to the next bite of information till you've done review from wherever the starting point was in the Mishnah or the Gemara on the Mishnah to where you're up, let's say an Amud later or 1.5 Amudim later. Don't go to the next piece of information till you've done a quick review of where you started to where you're up to. This way you constantly remain in the flow. And it's not just Shinun in the sense of review. Shinun, as you know, Gemara and Kedushin tells us, has 2 meanings. It means review, but it also means sharpen. And how do you get that? Review sharpens your mind. Because when you revisit what you've learnt, your mind will start noticing, 1 second, I went on this journey on the map before, but I didn't notice this detail on the side. And when you start going on that journey again and again and again, you're going to see more details that you didn't notice before, and you come up with new kashas and new terutzim. And your mind will start broadening and deepening by default, almost without effort. So number 9 is extremely important. Review the previous bites until now, and then go to the next bite of information. Okay, so do a quick review. Number 1, can you read the words accurately? Use Tuvia Shas or an equivalent. Number 2, can you translate each individual word? Number 3, punctuate the text. Number 4, put those first 3 together and come up with a Poshup Shat. What's the simple meaning of these 3 together? I've got enough clues to make sense out of this. Is it a question? Is it an answer? Is it a quote? What's the statement? Now, number 5, this is where the Gemara really begins. The format of the Gemara is at number 5. What kashas do you have on Pshat? What other questions do you have on Pshat? Number 6, what are your answers? You're following the sequence here and the logic. Number 7, now do review on that bite of information in order to get your kinyan. The Stipler says this many times, the kinyan only real review starts after the first 4 times. The first 4 times here is really to get the kinyan deep into you, and now you've got the kinyan because you've done Chazara, and he also brings that some Amoraim, they used to do Chazara 30 times or 40 times, and it's only one or 2 lines, so you could really do more than 4 times, but 4 times is the minimum. That we learn out from Moshe Rabbeinu. It happens to be very interesting, you'll find this in Toldos HaGra, that the Vilna Gaon, he would learn with anybody, but there was one criteria. It wasn't how brilliant that person's mind was, believe it or not. He did not need to be a Mitsuyan. There was one criteria. The Vilna Gaon would learn with anybody who would sit with him and learn the same sugya or pasuk or mishnah 101 times without getting bored. He offers in Evan Shlema of the Gra, in his Musa Sefer, he offers that Chazara is something you should never feel tired from. He said it's like when you kiss your son. Do you tire from kissing your son? No. Why? Because you love your son. He says Torah is so delicious that every Chazara is like re-embracing it. It's kissing it, hugging it, and holding it close. I don't want to let go. I don't want to forget it. So it was interesting that was the only criteria the Vilna Gaon had for choosing a Chavrusa. If he wouldn't tire after 101 times, you're for me. Why? Because you love Torah. How much? It doesn't matter how many times you revisit it, you love it the same, more and more and more, again and again. So 4 times minimum, and then go numbers 8 of this is now you can go to the next bite of information. Number 9, don't go to the next bite of information till you've done the first and second bite. Then you go through the same 6 steps again, then do your review to get the kinyan, and then you go to the next bite of information and quickly review from wherever you're up to where you're up to. And keep doing this format until what ends up happening is the children's minds are being developed to think, notice kashas, pay attention to detail, learn the taich of individual words. And as they keep doing Chazara, eventually their brain is focused on the Hebrew or Aramaic word without having to look at the taich, because they know the taich already. They've revisited it so many times. This is a very, I would even call it deceptively simple way for children in certainly the early stages of Haschalas Gemara, but even later on, where very often there are serious gaps in the children's limudim, meaning there are kids in 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, and sometimes beyond, who can't read accurately. That's going to sabotage their ability to become an independent learner. We will be blessed and lucky, I think, if they end up being a frum balabas who attends a shir, daf yomi, but they'll never be able to give the daf because they can't reconstruct it themselves. They can't read accurately. Reading accuracy is a must. Number 2, help them teach each individual word. There's so many resources today. There's no reason why in the classroom we can't get them to write that teach if they're not sure of it on top of every individual word. Now figure out the punctuation. Get the class into small groups to do this together. You're freed up from teaching, and then giving it back and on a test. Here, they're doing all the work. This is the real Vishinantam. They're reviewing it themselves. They're doing the work. Now I'm freed up to work one-on-one or with small groups while they're doing the first 4 steps. Now, when you ask the class, which groups are ready for step 5? and get them to do the steps. And after less than a week, the kids already know these are the steps they have to do for the next bite of information. The next bite of information. And they'll know all these steps on their own. And they can accumulate a written list of their questions and their tirutzim, and then we can have a class discussion of the kashas and the tirutzim. And now you, who've prepared the Rashba and the Ritva and the Pnei Yeshua and Rabbi Kiva Akers and the Ksais, and you've prepared the raid in the Balei Tosfos, Rashi, so you're ready to help them see where their kashas are in Rishonim, in Achreinim, in the Rashi. And they're going to feel $1 million. And this gives them a direct relationship with Rava, Abaya, with the Tanaim, with the Amoraim, with the Rishonim, with Achreinim. It almost doesn't matter, has the kid had some traumatic or not traumatic experiences at home, outside of the home, what's going on, Bein Hasadarim, are they, Has v'Shalom, looking at movies or whatever. All these things start to fade away. Do you know why? Because the dangers of internet, the dangers of movies, the dangers of all the taivas that are out there become much bigger when there's a vacuum that needs to be filled. But when a kid is starting to get a sipuk hanefesh, they are actually understanding it inside, and they see their mind developing, and they realize, oh my gosh, I'm mastering this Amud. I know the Amud from beginning to end. I can say it outside. And each time he does a review, if he's paying attention, and again, you remember 4 times review, hey, I'm getting clarity. And that becomes a kinyan. And there's nothing that beats that. Now I'm going to share with you the conclusion the Stipler has. Again, it's in his famous Sefer Kriyana Digrasa. Igeris number 10. And it's Ice Test through Yud Aleph. Let me share with you in conclusion. He says, number 1, get clarity with a chaver. That's why I said set up the classroom so that you got the kids paired off or in small groups of 3, maybe 4, and have them go through all those steps, because the clarity they have with a chaver, when you've got meeting of minds, it's chibur means to come together. The meeting of minds is synergy. You're more likely to come out with clarity because your friend doesn't agree with you. And that forces you to argue your case. And if you see that he can argue his position superior to yours, then you hopefully have the humility to be machnia to, and then go to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, Be'ezrat Hashem, who knows the sugya claw, is not there to deliver it to the children as much as get the kids to independently draw it out of the sugya themselves. So, clarity mostly comes by learning with a chaver tov. His lashon there is a chaver tov, a good friend. And then review. There's no substitute for this. Get the clarity and now do review on that clarity. At least 4 times. And if kids start to really enjoy the learning, by the time they get to the next Mishnah, they've already gone through the Gemara with the review many, many times. And they're going to have a much deeper understanding of the Gemara. There's much more to be said on this. I would recommend, I wrote a book on the subject of Derech HaLimud. It's called The 1 Minute Masmid. You can get it on Amazon.com. My son, Eli, wrote a book called The Frum Revolution, and he identifies components that children must have in order to be successful in what we have today is a text-based system. So the extent to which a child is successful in a text-based system, to a large extent, is going to determine how they feel good about their frumkeit, their Yiddishkeit, because so much of our learning is text-based, so much of the day in yeshiva is text-based, so much of the child's understanding of who I am and am I choshuv, am I valuable, is based on, am I successful in learning? So I would say those are 2 good resources, the 1 Minute Masmid and the Frum Revolution. Both are available on Amazon.com. Check out the Stipler, very important, and understand that clarity comes with the chaver tov. So you're setting the children up in the classroom to learn b'chavrusa and get them to do review. And you are now freed up to work with the weaker kids or help the kids who are ready for more stimulation to go ahead or start with a different Mishnah. And if they're really going ahead over here and you don't want them to go too far ahead of the class, get them to start with another Mishnah and do their own private project of going ahead in a different Masechta perhaps or different Perek, and then keep coming back to where the class is up to when the class is caught up to where they are in the classroom. So these are simple strategies to make learning Gemara meaningful and relevant and make the children realize, oh my gosh, I'm thinking like a Gemara. I am in the driver's seat. I am sitting next to Rava, Abaya, Ravina, Rav Ashi, Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan. This is how to have the children have a genuine taste of learning that's not based on understanding your pshat or pilpul and now me being able to say it back, but much rather I made the kinyan myself, and you, Rebbe, helped facilitate that. You helped direct me that by giving me the strategies, the map, the tools to be able to navigate learning Gemara in the schus of intelligently, so to speak, finding out ways to help our kids make sense of learning so that we're bringing the learning into their minds and then they become part of the learning themselves and are generating it by themselves. We should be zeich to see a lot of nachas from our children becoming independent learners, and the teachers of Klal Yisrael, we need an army of teachers of Klal Yisrael from our children's generation that are going to continue the Masorah into the coming of Mashiach B'mimheira Amenu. Amen.